"They're sending me to be your wife,
Promised me
sir,"
we would leave
the
tonight.
stranger
Why are you
whispered,
doing this?
and the Vampire King
We
replied.
don't have much time.
She held her cloak tightly around her, the coarse fabric scratching at her neck, and stared silently out the small window. Outside, the land stretched into rolling hills that faded into mist, forests that whispered secrets with the wind, and mountains that pierced the twilight sky. Each shadow seemed alive, moving and shifting as if it were watching her, judging her. "They're sending me to be your wife, sir," she whispered under her breath, repeating the words she had heard the messenger speak earlier that day. Her voice trembled, though she did not fully understand why. Was it fear or anticipation? Perhaps it was a mix of both. She did not know the man she was about to meet, the king who had ruled these lands for decades, feared and revered in equal measure. The castle rose before her carriage like a sentinel of stone and shadow, perched on cliffs that looked down over the darkened sea. Its spires reached into the sky, sharp as spears, and its walls were blackened with age and centuries of storms. She had heard the stories in her village, whispers told in candlelight, that the Vampire King did not smile, that he had taken countless brides before her, and that no one had ever truly tamed his heart. Yet she had come. She stepped out of the carriage, her boots crunching on gravel. The cold wind whipped her hair into her face, but she did not move her hand to brush it away. She was determined to meet her fate without flinching. Before her stood the guards, tall men with pale faces and eyes sharp as knives. They said nothing, merely bowed slightly and gestured for her to follow. Inside, the castle smelled of cold stone and ancient wood. The halls were vast and echoing, lit by torches whose flames flickered like living things. Shadows danced along the walls as though the castle itself were breathing. She felt a shiver crawl down her spine, but she forced herself to walk steadily. Every step brought her closer to the man who had haunted her thoughts since she learned of her impending marriage. In the grand hall he awaited her, the Vampire King. He sat on a throne carved of dark oak, the details twisting like thorny vines. His presence filled the room, commanding the air itself. He was tall, impossibly so, with skin pale as moonlight and hair black as midnight. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray with a hint of silver, and they seemed to pierce her very soul. For a moment she could not speak. "You have arrived," he said, his voice smooth and deep, echoing slightly in the vast hall. There was no anger, no warmth, only a quiet authority that made the room seem smaller, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. I am here," she replied, bowing her head respectfully. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat loud in her ears. He stood, gliding forward without a sound, his long coat sweeping the floor behind him. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the chill radiating from him. He looked at her carefully, and she felt as though he were reading not just her appearance but her thoughts, her fears, and her hidden desires. "You are not afraid," he said finally, a small trace of amusement in his voice. "I am afraid," she admitted softly, "but I must do this. I must come here." For a long moment he studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he gestured for her to rise and follow him. She obeyed, heart racing, as he led her through corridors lined with ancient tapestries, their colors faded but their stories still visible, battles, betrayals, and kings long dead. Each step echoed in the silence, the sound of their passage filling the air like a drumbeat. He brought her to a room at the far end of the castle, a chamber she would soon call her own. The walls were tall and adorned with paintings of long-forgotten queens. A large window looked out over the cliffs, where waves crashed against rocks below, sending up white spray that glimmered in the moonlight. The room was beautiful and terrifying all at once, a place that seemed suspended between reality and dreams. "This will be your room," he said, his voice softer now, though still commanding. "It is simple, but it will keep you safe." She nodded, unsure what to say. Words felt small in the presence of this man, whose very being seemed to command the world around him. She had imagined this meeting for days, Nights spent wondering what he would look like, how he would speak, whether he would be cruel or kind. Now standing before him, she realized she could not have imagined him fully. He was more than legend, more than fear. He was real. "Tonight you will rest," he continued. "Tomorrow your life will begin here." She swallowed, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, sir," she whispered. He inclined his head slightly and left the room without another word, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands gripping the covers tightly. Her mind raced with thoughts of the king, the castle, and the unknown that awaited her. She could feel the weight of the castle's history pressing down on her, the shadows whispering secrets she did not yet understand. The night passed slowly. She lay awake, listening to the wind howling outside, the sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs, and the occasional distant footstep in the halls. Sleep was elusive, replaced by a mixture of fear and curiosity. She wondered about the man she was to marry, the curse that bound him, and the life she would lead within these walls. Morning came with a pale light that filtered through the tall window. The castle seemed less frightening in daylight, but still full of mystery. She dressed simply and stepped out into the hall, determined to face whatever awaited her. He met her in the dining hall, where a meal had been prepared. The table was long, made of dark wood, and the chairs were high-backed, almost throne-like. The sunlight streamed through the windows, glinting off the silverware and making the room look almost ethereal. "Eat," he said, gesturing to the food. "You will need strength for the days ahead." She obeyed, sitting quietly and taking small bites, her eyes constantly flicking toward him. He watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She wanted to speak, to ask questions about him, about the kingdom, about the curse, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, she focused on the simple act of eating, though every bite felt heavy with meaning. Finally, he spoke again. "You must understand this. Life in this castle is not simple. There are rules, traditions, and dangers you do not yet know. But if you are willing, you may find a place here, not just as my bride, but as someone who can stand beside me." Her heart skipped. I want to learn, sir. I want to understand." He regarded her silently for a long moment. Then he nodded slightly. "Very well. You will learn, but the lessons will be harsh. You must be ready to face them." Throughout the day, he led her through the castle, showing her the library filled with ancient tomes, the armory lined with weapons that had never seen battle, and the gardens that thrived even in the shadow of the cliffs. Everywhere they went, she felt the weight of his gaze, the power he held, and the history that clung to him like a shadow. By evening, they returned to the high tower that overlooked the sea. The sky was a deep violet, and the first stars of night began to shine. She looked out over the water, feeling both small and infinite, and realized that her life had changed forever. He stood behind her, silent as always. After a long pause, he spoke. "You may fear me, and that is natural, but know this: fear is different from weakness. Fear sharpens the mind, strengthens the heart. If you survive it, you may yet find courage you did not know existed." She turned slightly to look at him. "And what about you?" she asked softly. "Do you fear anything?" For the first time, she saw a flicker in his eyes, something almost human. "Perhaps," he admitted quietly, "but that is a story for another time." She felt a strange pull toward him, a curiosity mingled with trepidation. She wanted to know the man behind the legend, the being behind the power. And perhaps, in some unspoken way, she wanted him to see her, not just as a stranger, not just as a bride, but as someone who could matter. The night deepened, and the stars shimmered above. In that quiet, suspended moment, she realized that her journey had only just begun. The shadows of the castle seemed to watch, whispering secrets and promises alike. She could not yet see the path ahead, but she felt, deep within, that it would be a journey unlike any other. And somewhere in the silence of the castle, the vampire king watched her as well, pondering the stranger who had arrived unafraid, whose presence stirred echoes of long-forgotten emotions, and whose fate was now entwined with his own. The castle held its breath. Tomorrow the lessons would begin. The sun rose slowly over the cliffs, casting a pale, golden light across the castle. The stranger awoke to the distant cries of gulls and the steady crash of waves against the rocks below. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she remembered the king's words from the night before. "Tomorrow, your life will begin here." Breakfast was served in silence. The vampire king entered the hall as the clock struck 8, moving like a shadow gliding over the floor. He did not smile, did not speak at length, but his presence was enough to fill the room. The stranger watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes caught the light, the slow precision of his movements, and the quiet authority that seemed to bend the room to his will. "You will walk with me today," he said finally. His voice was calm, almost gentle, yet every word carried the weight of command. She nodded, and he led her out of the dining hall. The corridors they passed through were long and narrow, lined with stone statues whose expressions seemed to shift in the flickering torchlight. At times she felt the eyes of the castle upon her, judging her every step. "The castle is more than stone and mortar," the king said, breaking the silence. "It is history, memory, and power. Everything within these walls has meaning. You must learn it all if you wish to survive." She swallowed hard. I will try," she replied, her voice small but firm. He glanced at her briefly as if measuring her resolve. "Try is not enough," he said softly. "You must commit. You must be ready to face what is hidden, not just what is seen." Their first lesson began in the library, a vast hall filled with rows of towering shelves and ancient tomes. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old paper. The king gestured to the nearest shelf, and the stranger began to read aloud, her voice echoing faintly. As she read, he watched her closely, noting the way her hands trembled slightly but her voice remained steady. Occasionally, he would correct a word or pause to explain the meaning behind a passage, his tone neither harsh nor kind but precise. "You have a good mind," he said finally, after hours of study. "Curiosity is rare in these walls. Most are afraid to question, afraid to think. Do not be." Her chest swelled with a mixture of pride and anxiety. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. He nodded, then led her to the armory. The room smelled of metal and oil. Weapons of all kinds lined the walls, swords, spears, and shields, each polished to perfection. The king picked up a long, black blade and handed it to her. "Defense is not just about strength," he said. "It is about understanding. You must know your opponent, their intentions, and their weaknesses." She grasped the weapon, feeling its weight, and listened as he demonstrated the movement slowly and deliberately. He moved like a shadow, precise and lethal, yet there was a strange elegance to his motions. When she tried to mimic him, she stumbled several times, but he did not scold her. Instead, he observed, correcting her gently, guiding her hands, and showing her the subtle shifts of balance that made all the difference. Hours passed in this way, and by evening her muscles ached, but her mind felt sharper. She realized that this man, so feared by all, was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. He demanded excellence, yes, but he also revealed truths that others would hide. As night fell, the king brought her to the gardens. They were strange and beautiful, filled with flowers that glowed faintly in the moonlight, vines that twisted like serpents, and statues of long-dead queens watching silently. A small fountain bubbled in the center, its water catching the silver light of the moon. "Most brides fear these gardens," the king said quietly, standing beside her. "They do not understand the power that lies in beauty and silence. They underestimate it. You must not." She gazed at the flowers and the statues, the shadows and the light, feeling a strange sense of wonder. I will try not to," she said softly. The king turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You are not like the others," he said, his voice low. "You have courage and curiosity. That is dangerous, but also necessary." She felt a shiver run down her spine. Was it fear? or the strange pull she felt toward him, perhaps both. She did not know how to respond. Words seemed small in the presence of this man who commanded both respect and fascination. Days passed, and each one was filled with lessons and tests. The king challenged her in every way he could: intellect, skill, endurance, and courage. He spoke little of his past, but fragments of his history emerged through stories of battles, of loss, and of choices that had haunted him for centuries. She began to understand why he was feared. Not because of cruelty alone, but because of the weight he carried, the loneliness, the responsibility, the curse that shadowed him. One evening, as a storm raged outside, she found herself alone in the hall, reading an ancient book about the castle's history. Lightning flashed through the tall windows, illuminating the stone walls and throwing shadows that danced like ghosts. She did not notice the king enter until he spoke. "Knowledge is not enough," he said quietly. "Understanding is what matters. You must see not just the words, but the meaning behind them." She looked up, startled, and nodded. I understand, sir." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "Do you," he asked, his voice almost a whisper, "do you truly understand what it means to live here, to survive, to face what is hidden?" She swallowed, meeting his gaze. "I want to try. I want to learn." He regarded her for a long moment, and in the silence she felt something shift, an unspoken recognition, a fragile connection that neither dared to name. The next day, the king took her to the tower that overlooked the cliffs. The wind was strong, whipping her hair around her face, and the sea below roared with untamed power. "You must understand," he said, standing beside her, "that life here is not safe. Danger exists both from without and within. You will face tests not only of skill but of heart. Courage alone is not enough." She shivered, whether from the wind or from the gravity of his words she could not tell. "I am ready," she said, though her voice betrayed the slightest tremor. He turned to her, his eyes intense. "Are you?" he asked, almost challenging her. "Because the castle will not forgive weakness. It will expose it, feed on it, and punish it. And he paused, his gaze lingering on her, "I will not save you from what must be faced." Her heart raced, and yet a strange thrill ran through her. This was no ordinary life. This was a place of power, of darkness, of lessons that cut deeper than any sword. And she was part of it now, whether she wanted to be or not. Days became weeks. Each day brought new challenges: deciphering old texts in the library, practicing with weapons in the armory, navigating the secret halls and chambers of the castle. The king remained a constant presence, always observing, always guiding, always testing. Yet amidst the rigor and discipline, there were moments of quiet connection. A shared look over a book, a word of encouragement, a rare flicker of humor in the king's eyes. Each moment was small, almost imperceptible, but it left an impression, a spark in the shadows that neither dared to name. One night, as the moon rose full and bright, she found herself standing alone in the gardens, listening to the whispers of the wind and the song of the fountain. The air was cool, carrying the scent of flowers and the sea. She did not know why, but she felt a presence behind her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the king said, stepping into the moonlight. She turned, startled, and nodded. "Yes, it is." He walked beside her, silent for a moment. "You have learned much," he said softly, "and yet you have much more to learn. Not just about the castle, but about yourself, about courage, and about fear." She looked up at him, her heart beating fast. I want to learn. I want to understand." He stopped and turned to face her. The wind stirred his hair, and the moonlight caught in his eyes, making them shine like silver. "And if what you learn frightens you?" he asked, his voice almost tender. "Then I will face it," she said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, almost like a promise. "Very well," he said. "Tomorrow your true lessons begin." As he walked away, she felt a strange mixture of fear, anticipation, and something else. something she did not yet understand. She watched him disappear into the shadows of the castle, wondering what the next day would bring, and whether she was truly ready for the trials to come. The night was quiet, but the castle seemed alive, as if it knew the change that had begun. Shadows shifted in the corners, whispers floated through the halls, and the wind carried secrets she could almost hear but not fully understand. And somewhere in the high tower, the vampire king paused, thinking of the stranger who had arrived unafraid, who had met his challenges with courage, and who had begun to touch a part of him that he had long believed lost. The castle held its breath once more. Tomorrow, the dance of power would continue, and neither of them would emerge unchanged. The morning mist curled around the castle like ghostly fingers, and the stranger walked quietly along the cold stone corridors. Today felt different. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a weight that pressed on her chest and quickened her heartbeat. She had begun to feel the power of the castle in a new way, not just its physical presence, but its history, its secrets, and its shadows. The Vampire King awaited her in the library as always, but today his expression was unreadable, more distant than she had ever seen. The books he had brought for her were thicker, older, filled with histories and legends she did not yet understand. "You are learning," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "But knowledge alone is not enough. You must understand the stories, the people, the choices that shape this kingdom. Only then can you see the truth of what binds us here." She nodded. I will try, sir." He did not respond immediately, only gestured for her to begin reading. As she spoke the words aloud, she felt them reverberate in the room, echoing off the walls and into the shadows. There were stories of kings and queens, of battles fought in blood and darkness, of alliances formed and betrayed. And hidden within those pages were hints of the curse that shadowed the Vampire King, an ancient bond with a power she did not yet comprehend. Hours passed, and as the sun dipped low behind the cliffs, the king finally closed the book. He looked at her, his eyes stormy and unreadable. "Do you know why brides have failed here?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. She shook her head. "Because of the curse." He smiled faintly, a small, almost human gesture. "Partly. But more than that, they failed because they could not face themselves. They could not endure the darkness, both within these walls and within me. You are different. You do not yet understand the danger, but you do not shy away from it." She felt a shiver run down her spine, but there was also a strange pride. She wanted to meet his gaze fully, to prove she could endure whatever lay ahead. Before she could speak, a soft sound drifted through the room, a faint whisper of wind, though the windows were closed. The king's eyes narrowed and he stood abruptly. "Come," he said, motioning for her to follow. They moved through the corridors until they reached a spiral staircase that descended into darkness. The stranger hesitated, feeling a strange apprehension. "This is the old part of the castle," the king explained. "Few enter here. Many fear what lies beneath." She followed him anyway, each step echoing in the narrow stone stairwell. At the bottom, the air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of earth and history. Ancient murals covered the walls, depicting battles between kings, queens, and creatures of shadow. "This is where the past lives," the king said, gesturing to the murals, "where history is preserved not just in books but in stone and blood." She studied the murals, her eyes widening as she recognized a figure that looked very much like the king, though younger, fighting beside a woman who was unknown to her. "Who is she?" she asked quietly. The king's gaze darkened. "Someone I lost long ago. And someone whose story repeats even now in ways that are both cruel and inevitable." She swallowed hard. I don't understand." He looked at her intently. "You will in time. There is a reason you were sent here, why you survived the journey, why you are standing before me. The castle does not choose randomly. Fate is not kind, but it is rarely wrong." Her thoughts raced. Could it be that she was not just a bride, but part of something much larger, part of the curse itself? The idea terrified her, but it also stirred a strange courage within her. Over the following days, the king began to reveal more of the castle's secrets. He showed her hidden chambers, forgotten gardens, and tunnels that led beneath the cliffs to the roaring sea. He told her stories of the kingdom's past, of rulers who had come and gone, and of choices that had shaped the present. With each story, she began to see the shadows that haunted him, not just the curse, but the weight of immortality, the loneliness, and the regrets of centuries. Yet despite the lessons, she felt herself drawn to him. There were moments when he spoke softly, when his eyes lingered on hers, and she glimpsed something almost human beneath the fearsome exterior. She began to understand that courage alone was not enough. She needed trust, and perhaps, in time, love. One evening, as a storm raged over the cliffs, they stood together in the tower that overlooked the sea. The wind tore at her cloak and hair, the waves crashing below like thunder. The king stood beside her, silent, watching the horizon. "You fear what you cannot control," he said finally, his voice low. I fear many things," she admitted, "but I do not want to run." He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the storm. "Good. Fear is not a weakness but a guide. It shows us what we must face, what we must conquer." She felt a strange warmth at his words, a connection that went beyond the lessons, beyond the fear. But before she could respond, a sudden noise interrupted them, a harsh, echoing crack from the lower halls of the castle. The king's expression hardened. "Stay here," he ordered. "Do not move." She nodded, heart racing, as he disappeared down the stairs into the darkness. Moments later, she heard a clash of metal and a low, guttural sound, something not entirely human. Her pulse quickened, fear and fascination mingling. She wanted to follow, to help, but she knew better. The castle itself seemed to hum with anticipation, the shadows alive and watching. When he returned, his expression was calm, though his eyes burned with intensity. "The castle tests us," he said simply. "Tonight was a reminder. Danger lurks in unexpected places, and we must be ready." She nodded silently, though her mind was racing. There was more to the castle, more to the king, and more to the story that had brought her here. She could feel it in her bones. This was only the beginning of what she would have to face. In the following days, she discovered a hidden truth about herself. In the dusty corners of the library, buried among ancient scrolls, she found a record of her own family. Her ancestors had once served the kingdom, bound by loyalty and secrets. And within that lineage was a connection to the curse, a link that had been dormant for generations, now stirring awake. When she told the king, he did not respond immediately. He studied her, his expression unreadable, before finally saying, "So it is not just you who is learning. You were brought here for a reason. You are part of the story as much as I am, and that story is dangerous." She felt a chill run through her. The realization was both frightening and exhilarating. She was not merely a bride, not merely a guest in this castle. She was entwined with its fate and with his. The tension between them grew, subtle but undeniable. Every glance, every word, every silence carried meaning. There were moments when their proximity felt almost unbearable, charged with unspoken emotion and longing. Yet they remained careful, aware of the danger and the stakes. Love and fear, trust and caution, all danced in the same shadowed space. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered the castle halls. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and damp. She found herself in the forgotten chapel, a place she had not yet explored. The walls were covered in faded murals depicting angels and warriors, light and shadow intertwined. Candles flickered in the corners, casting a gentle glow. As she stepped forward, she felt a presence behind her. "You should not be here alone," the king said softly. She turned, startled, but met his gaze. "I needed to see," she admitted, "to understand." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "And what do you see?" "I see history," she said quietly. "I see shadows and I see hope. I see a story that is bigger than either of us." He nodded slowly. "Yes, And the story is not yet finished. You will face choices that test you in ways you cannot imagine, but you are stronger than you know. For a moment they stood in silence, the only sound the faint flicker of candlelight and the distant echo of the sea. In that stillness she felt the connection between them deepen, a fragile, unspoken bond that promised both danger and redemption. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "you will face a trial unlike any before. The castle, the past, and your own lineage will converge. You must be ready." She nodded, a mixture of fear and determination in her chest. "I will be ready." And as she left the chapel and returned to her room, she knew that the next day would change everything. Shadows of the past were rising, and both she and the Vampire King would be tested like never before. The castle held its breath, and so did she, knowing that the dance of power, trust, and destiny was only beginning. The castle seemed different that morning. The sun rose slowly, painting the stone walls in shades of gold and crimson, but the light could not touch the shadows that lingered in every corner. The stranger dressed quickly, her hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of what awaited her. Today the lessons would become trials. Today the past and the present would collide. The Vampire King was already waiting in the high hall, his expression as calm and unreadable as always. But she could see the storm behind his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Even he, the ruler of shadows and centuries, seemed affected by what was to come. "You are ready," he said softly, though his voice carried the authority of command. "Perhaps more than you know, but readiness is not certainty. You will face truths that may frighten you, that may challenge all you believe." She nodded. "I am not afraid, sir, not of what is to come." He studied her carefully. "Bravery alone is not enough. You must face yourself as well as the trials. Only then will the path forward open." They descended the spiral staircase into the old part of the castle. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the scent of earth, stone, and time itself. The stranger felt the castle watching, its walls alive with history and secrets. Every shadow seemed to move, every whisper carried meaning. At the bottom, the king paused. "The chamber ahead holds what you must confront first. Your lineage, the past of this castle, and the power that flows through it are all intertwined. You must face them." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Her ancestors had once served this kingdom, bound by duty and secrets. And now she was here, connected to a curse older than any story she had read. This was not only about survival, it was about understanding, about claiming her place in a history that had long been hidden. The chamber door creaked open, revealing a room filled with ancient mirrors. Each reflected not only her own image but also faint, ghostly figures, faces of the past, her ancestors, and even moments from the king's long life. The air was heavy, vibrating with energy that made her skin prickle. "Step forward," the king instructed. "Do not look away. The truth lies within the reflection, and only by seeing it can you move forward." She approached, her heart pounding. The mirrors seemed to ripple as she drew closer, and she saw visions. Her family pledging loyalty to the castle centuries ago, her ancestors facing choices that shaped the kingdom, and a faint, dark figure. The Vampire King, younger, bound by shadows and sorrow. I see," she whispered. "I understand some of it." The king nodded. "Good, but understanding is not enough. You must embrace it. Accept that the past is part of you and part of me. Only then can we confront what comes next." She closed her eyes, letting the visions wash over her, feeling the weight of centuries in her veins. Courage surged within her, not the absence of fear, but the strength to face it. When she opened her eyes, the mirrors had faded, replaced by the chamber's stone walls. She turned to the king, whose gaze was steady, approving. "Now," he said, "we face the final test." He led her through the castle to the cliffs. The sea below roared, waves crashing against jagged rocks. Lightning flickered in the distance, though the sky was mostly clear. In the center of the cliff, carved into the stone, was an ancient circle, runes etched by hands long dead, pulsing faintly with silver light. "This is where the curse began," the king said, his voice low, "where the choices of the past bound me to shadows and solitude. Tonight we confront it and perhaps we break it." The stranger felt a shiver run through her. She knew this was not just a ritual of power, it was a moment of reckoning for both of them. She reached out, taking his hand. He looked at her, storm clouds in his eyes, and for the first time she saw vulnerability beneath the centuries of strength. "Together," she said firmly. "We face it together." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Together." The runes glowed brighter as they stepped into the circle. The air hummed with energy, thick and heavy. Shadows rose around them, twisting into shapes that reflected fears and regrets. The stranger felt herself confronting moments she had not yet understood. Her own doubts, her fear of failure, and the weight of the family she had discovered. Beside her, the vampire king faced his own demons, visions of lost loved ones, battles won and lost, centuries of solitude. The air around them crackled with tension, the past and present colliding in a storm of shadow and light. "You are strong," he said, almost to himself. "Perhaps stronger than I ever imagined." She squeezed his hand. "And you are not alone anymore. You do not have to face it alone." The circle of light pulsed, the runes glowing brighter. Shadows writhed, then began to dissipate, drawn away by the bond they had formed, the courage, the trust, and the understanding between them. The stranger felt the weight lift, a freedom she could not have imagined, and the king exhaled, releasing centuries of tension. When the light faded, they stood together, hands entwined, the runes dim but still faintly glowing. The curse, the shadows of the past, had been faced, and perhaps broken. The king looked at her, his eyes softer than they had ever been. "You have done more than survive," he said quietly. "You have changed the course of this story and perhaps even my own." Her heart swelled, a mixture of relief, triumph, and an emotion she had not yet named. "We did it together." For the first time, the castle seemed different. The halls were lighter, not because the stone had changed, but because the shadows had shifted. The air felt alive, carrying a promise of possibility, of life beyond fear and duty. They returned to the tower overlooking the sea. The night was calm now, the storm having passed completely. The waves sparkled in the moonlight, silver and serene. The stranger leaned against the railing, feeling the cool wind on her face. The king joined her, standing close but not touching. For a long moment they simply looked at the sea, letting the silence speak. Then he spoke, his voice low and contemplative. "Your courage has done what centuries of power could not. You have shown me that even in shadow, light can exist. That even in solitude, connection can be found." She turned to him, her heart racing. "And you have shown me strength I did not know I had, and something more, something I cannot yet name." He studied her for a long moment. "Perhaps that something is trust, perhaps it is hope, perhaps it is love." Her breath caught, and for a moment neither spoke. The wind carried their unspoken emotions across the cliffs, the sea reflecting their courage and vulnerability. Finally, he extended his hand, and she took it without hesitation. "Then we face what comes next," he said. "Together," she nodded, her heart full. "Together." The castle, once a place of shadows and fear, now seemed alive with possibility. The lessons, the trials, the darkness, they had all led to this moment. They had faced the past, embraced the present, and claimed a future together. As dawn approached, the first rays of light touched the cliffs, painting the world in soft hues of pink and gold. The vampire king and the stranger stood side by side, hands entwined, watching as the darkness lifted. Shadows still existed, they always would, but they had learned to face them, and in doing so had found strength, courage, and a bond that transcended fear. The kingdom itself seemed to sigh, as if relieved. The castle walls, the gardens, the hidden chambers, all bore witness to the triumph of courage, trust, and love. And somewhere deep within the castle, in the quiet corners and shadowed halls, the whisper of history continued. But now it was no longer only a story of fear. It was a story of redemption, of transformation, and of hearts intertwined in a world of shadows and light. The stranger looked up at the king, her eyes meeting his with unspoken understanding. "We have survived," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady but warm. "And in surviving, we have changed everything." The wind carried their words across the cliffs and out to the sea, blending with the sound of waves, the cries of distant gulls, and the quiet heartbeat of a kingdom reborn. The vampire king and the stranger stood together, shadows behind them, light before them, and a story rewritten by courage, trust, and love. The castle held its breath, no longer with fear but with hope. And in that moment they were free, free to face the future together at last.